This 1861 family photo looked elegant, but the enslaved woman's glove hid something horrific. The daguerreotype arrived at the National Museum of African American History in a mahogany case lined with faded purple velvet. Dr. Angela Morrison lifted it carefully from its shipping container, her practiced hands steady despite the anticipation she always felt when opening these historical capsules. The metal plate gleamed dully under her laboratory lights, showing the characteristic silvery surface of 1860s photography, though time had laid a veil of tarnish across the image. Angela set the daguerreotype in her examination tray and adjusted her magnifying lamp. The photograph showed a family portrait taken indoors, unusual for the era when most photographs were made outdoors due to lighting requirements. The setting was clearly a plantation house parlor. She could see ornate wallpaper, heavy curtains, the edge of what appeared to be a piano. The family sat arranged in classical Victorian composition. The patriarch, in a chair at center, his wife beside him, 3 children positioned around them like decorative objects. But it was the figure standing behind the seated matriarch that made Angela lean closer. A woman, perhaps 30 years old, stood with perfect posture, her dark dress simple against the family's elaborate clothing. And on her hands, incongruous, striking, she wore white gloves. Elegant white gloves that seemed utterly out of place with her plain servant's dress. "That's odd," Angela murmured to herself, making a note in her examination log. Her colleague Marcus appeared at her workstation with coffee, a Monday morning ritual they'd maintained for 5 years. "New acquisition?" he asked, peering at the photograph. "Estate sale from Baton Rouge," Angela said, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Dated April 1861, right at the start of the Civil War." She pointed to the woman in the background. "Look at her hands." Marcus adjusted the lamp angle, studying the image. "White gloves? On an enslaved woman?" His voice carried the same puzzlement Angela felt. "Exactly. Why would they dress her in white gloves for a family portrait?" Angela zoomed her digital camera on the woman's hands, capturing high-resolution images. "It doesn't fit. The gloves are expensive, delicate. They're the kind of accessory a wealthy woman would wear to church or social event. But her dress is plain cotton, clearly servant's clothing. Maybe they wanted the portrait to look more refined? Having a well-dressed servant in the background would signal wealth and culture? Angela shook her head slowly, her instincts telling her there was something else here. "No. Look at how she's holding her hands. See that tension? Her fingers aren't relaxed. They're pressed together, almost rigid." She increased the magnification further. "And there. Do you see that? On the right glove near the wrist, that's not a shadow or damage to the plate." Marcus leaned in until his nose nearly touched the monitor. "It looks like a stain?" "A dark stain," Angela confirmed, her heart beginning to beat faster. "On white fabric, on a photograph where everything else is meticulously clean and arranged." She sat back, looking at the woman's face now. The expression was neutral, eyes downcast in the expected pose of servitude. But there was something in the set of her jaw, a tightness around her mouth that spoke of pain. "I need to restore this," Angela said. "Completely. Whatever's under those gloves, whatever that stain is, we need to see it clearly." Marcus knew that tone. Angela had found something that mattered. "How long will it take?" "However long it takes," she said, already preparing her documentation forms. "This woman has been standing in the background of this photograph for 163 years. I think she's ready to tell us what really happened in that parlor in 1861. Angela began the restoration process with systematic thoroughness, documenting every stage with photographs and detailed notes. The daguerreotype was in better condition than many she'd worked with. The family had clearly stored it carefully, preserving their legacy. But time had still taken its toll. Silver oxidation clouded portions of the image, and there were areas of tarnish that obscured fine details. She started with dry cleaning, using brushes softer than eyelashes to remove surface dust accumulated over more than a century and a half. Each stroke revealed a little more clarity. The patriarch's watch chain emerged in sharp detail. The matriarch's elaborate brooch caught the light. The children's faces showed with touching clarity. The oldest boy trying to look serious, the younger one fighting a smile, the little girl's eyes wide with the effort of staying still. And behind them all, the woman in white gloves stood perfectly motionless, as if she'd turned to stone. By the end of the first day, Angela had cleaned enough of the surface to see the photograph's full composition clearly. The parlor was even more opulent than she'd first realized. She could now make out gold frame paintings on the walls, a crystal chandelier partially visible at the top of the frame, furniture that spoke of serious wealth. This was a family at the height of antebellum prosperity, capturing their world before the war would change everything. The next phase required chemical treatment. Angela mixed her solutions with precise measurements, testing pH levels multiple times before she was satisfied. She would work on small sections at a time, reducing the silver sulfide that had darkened the image, bringing out details that had been invisible for decades. She decided to start with the woman's face, wanting to see more clearly the person behind that neutral expression. As she applied her solution with cotton swabs barely larger than toothpicks, features began to emerge with startling clarity. The woman was younger than Angela had first thought. Late 20s, perhaps 30 at most. Her cheekbones were high and elegant. Her skin, even rendered in the monochrome of daguerreotype silver, showed evidence of careful grooming. This was someone who worked inside the house, not in the fields. Someone the family wanted to present as part of their household's refinement. But as the woman's face cleared, Angela noticed something that made her pause. There was a small scar near the left temple, barely visible but unmistakable once revealed, and another, finer line along the jaw. These weren't accident scars. They were too regular, too deliberate. Marcus stopped by as evening approached, finding Angela still bent over her microscope. "You should go home," he said gently. "Get some rest." "Look at her face," Angela said instead, gesturing him closer. "These scars, they're punishment marks. Small, designed not to show too obviously, but they're there." Marcus studied the enhanced images on Angela's monitor. The family wanted her to look presentable for the photograph, but they couldn't completely erase what they'd done to her. "And they gave her white gloves?" Angela said, her voice hardening. "Expensive, beautiful white gloves. Why?" She looked at the image again, at those carefully positioned hands. What were they hiding? On the third day of restoration, Angela focused on the woman's hands. She worked with even more care than usual, sensing that whatever secret this photograph held, it was here, concealed beneath elegant white fabric. The gloves had been photographed with remarkable clarity. She could see the delicate texture of the fabric, the tiny stitching along the seams. They were quality gloves, probably French-made, the kind a wealthy woman would wear to a garden party or church service. But as Angela removed layers of tarnish and oxidation, details began to emerge that didn't fit the narrative of elegance. The stain she'd noticed on the right glove became clearer. It was definitely dark, seeping through from underneath. And now she could see there was a corresponding mark on the left glove as well, fainter but present. "Those are bloodstains," Marcus said, looking over her shoulder at the enhanced images. Angela nodded grimly. Old blood, dried blood that soaked through from underneath. She increased magnification on the right hand. "And look here, the glove isn't sitting smoothly on her hand. See how the fabric bunches slightly near the knuckles? And there, the fingertips. They're not the right shape." "What do you mean?" "The glove should follow the natural contour of the fingers, but look at the index and middle finger on the right hand. The fabric is compressed oddly, as if..." Angela trailed off, her stomach turning as understanding dawned. "As if the fingers underneath aren't straight, as if they're damaged." She spent the rest of the day working exclusively on the hands, applying her chemical solutions in progressively stronger concentrations to areas where the oxidation was most severe. By late afternoon, she had enhanced the image enough to see clearly what the daguerreotype had captured 163 years ago. The white gloves were stained with blood that had seeped through from the wounds underneath. The right hand showed clear deformation. The fingers were bent unnaturally, suggesting broken bones that had healed incorrectly or not healed at all. The left hand, while less obviously damaged, showed similar irregularities. And along the wrist of the right glove, where the fabric met skin, Angela could now see what appeared to be bandaging underneath, visible as a slight ridge beneath the glove's edge. "They gave her gloves to hide her hands," Angela said quietly. "They wanted this portrait to show their refinement, their civilization. They couldn't have their house servant standing in the photograph with mutilated hands, so they covered the evidence." Marcus was silent for a long moment. "Can you see what's actually under the gloves? Can you see the injuries themselves?" "No. The gloves block that completely." Angela sat back from her microscope, feeling exhausted and angry. "But I can document what we can see. The bloodstains, the deformation, the obvious signs of recent trauma." She looked at the woman's face again, at that carefully neutral expression. She stood behind this family with her hands destroyed, wearing gloves to hide what they'd done to her, and she kept her face calm because she had no choice. "We need to find out who she was," Marcus said, "and what they did to her." Angela was already reaching for her phone to call their historical consultant. "I know," she said. "This woman deserves to have her story told. All of it." Dr. Raymond Foster arrived from New Orleans 2 days later, his weathered briefcase stuffed with documents he'd pulled from Louisiana archives as soon as Angela had called. He was a specialist in antebellum Louisiana plantation records, and when Angela had described the photograph and what she'd found, his immediate response had been, "I need to see this." Now he stood in Angela's laboratory, studying the enhanced images of the woman's gloved hands on her computer monitor. His face was grim. "I've seen this before," he said quietly. "Not photographed, but described in medical records and testimony. This kind of injury has a name." Angela waited, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Finger breaking," Raymond said. "Specifically, the intentional breaking of fingers as punishment. It was documented by abolitionists, testified to by formerly enslaved people after the war. Some enslavers used it as punishment for specific infractions." He pointed to the deformation visible under the glove. "The fingers are broken at multiple joints, then left to heal without medical treatment. It causes permanent deformity and chronic pain. And it served a dual purpose: punishment and prevention." "Prevention of what?" Marcus asked, though Angela suspected she already knew the answer. "Of learning to write," Raymond said. "Of holding tools that might be used for escape. Of having hands dexterous enough to pick locks or manipulate small objects." He looked at Angela. "Where was this photograph taken? Do we have provenance?" Angela pulled up the acquisition file. "Estate sale in Baton Rouge. The photograph came with other family documents. The estate belonged to descendants of a family named..." She checked her notes. Actually, the auction house only listed it as Louisiana Plantation Family, circa 1861. No specific names in the catalog. Oh, that's unusual, Raymond said. These families were usually proud of their heritage. They kept meticulous records. Unless there was something they wanted to hide, Marcus suggested. Raymond nodded slowly. Let me see the photograph case again. Angela handed him the mahogany case, and he examined it carefully, turning it over to inspect every angle. On the back, barely visible, were initials carved into the wood. J.M. J.M., Raymond murmured. That's not much, but it's a start. He pulled out his laptop and began searching through digitized plantation records. There were dozens of plantations in the Baton Rouge area in 1861, but only a few dozen owned by families with those initials. He typed rapidly, cross-referencing databases. Let's narrow it by date. April 1861. That's significant timing. Why? Angela asked. Because Fort Sumter was attacked on April 12, 1861. The Civil War had just begun. This photograph was taken in the first weeks of the war. Raymond pulled up a list of names. Families wealthy enough to commission an indoor daguerreotype with the initials J.M. in the Baton Rouge area. He scanned the results. Here, Jacques Mercier, French Creole family, sugar plantation, 3,000 acres. The estate records are housed at LSU. I can access them remotely. He worked in focused silence for several minutes while Angela and Marcus watched. Finally, Raymond sat back, his expression troubled. Jacques Mercier, age 48 in 1861, married to Celeste, née Boudreau. 3 children and, he read from the screen, household staff of 42 enslaved people, including 16 who worked in the main house. Do they list names? Angela asked. They do. Raymond scrolled through the digitized ledger. Here's the household staff list from 1860. They're listed by function. Butler, cook, lady's maid. He stopped. Here, Marie, age 29, lady's maid and seamstress. Recently disciplined for infractions. Hands damaged but recovering. Still suitable for light household duties. The words hung in the air like poison. Angela felt her throat tighten. They recorded it. They actually wrote down that they'd damaged her hands. They kept meticulous records, Raymond said quietly, including records of punishments. It was considered proper plantation management. He looked at the photograph again, at Marie standing behind the family in her white gloves. Now we know her name. Now we find out what she did to deserve this brutality. Raymond spent the next week deep in the Louisiana State University archives, both digital and physical, piecing together Marie's story from plantation records, bills of sale, correspondence, and legal documents. What he found was both devastating and revealing. Marie had been born on a rice plantation in Charleston, South Carolina, in 1832. She was sold at age 12 to a family in New Orleans, where she was trained as a lady's maid, taught to style hair, mend fine clothing, assist with dressing. The skills that made her valuable also set her apart. By age 16, she could read and write, skills she'd learned secretly from the youngest daughter of the house, who had felt rebellious and fond of her maid. In 1857, Marie was sold again. The New Orleans family needed money, and Marie, with her valuable skills and literacy, commanded a high price. Jacques Mercier purchased her for $1,500, a substantial sum, to serve as lady's maid to his wife Celeste. For 3 years, Marie served the Mercier household. The plantation records showed regular notations about her work. Excellent seamstress, maintains Madame's wardrobe impeccably, quiet and obedient. She seemed to have been everything an enslaver could want in a house servant. Until January 1861. Raymond found the entry in Jacques Mercier's personal journal, kept alongside the plantation ledgers. His hands trembled slightly as he read it aloud to Angela over the phone. Discovered Marie reading newspapers in my study. She had taken documents from my desk, letters regarding plantation business and politics. When confronted, she showed no appropriate remorse. She claimed she had a right to knowledge. Such insolence cannot be tolerated. Have decided on suitable punishment that will prevent future infractions while preserving her usefulness to Celeste. He broke her hands because she read his newspapers, Angela said, her voice hollow. Because she asserted a right to knowledge, Raymond corrected grimly. Because she refused to accept her designated place. He continued reading from other documents. A week later, there's a bill from a local doctor. Not for treating Marie, but for consultation regarding appropriate disciplinary methods that minimize the loss of property value. The doctor recommended breaking specific fingers that would prevent writing and fine manipulation while leaving enough function for basic household tasks. The cruelty was methodical, planned, executed with medical consultation to ensure it achieved its purpose without completely destroying Marie's economic value. Angela felt sick. There's more, Raymond said. In March 1861, Celeste Mercier wrote to her sister in Baton Rouge. Listen, my maid Marie continues her recovery. Her spirits remain low, though her rebellious nature seems adequately chastened. Jacques insists she attend us for the family portrait Mr. Devereaux will make next month. I have purchased fine gloves to cover the unfortunate appearance of her hands. We must present properly, even now as war threatens our way of life. They dressed her wounds in expensive gloves so they could pretend to be civilized, Marcus said. He was standing beside Angela, listening on speakerphone. Yes, Raymond said. And here's the crucial detail. The photograph was taken on April 6, 1861, less than 3 months after her hands were broken. The injuries would still have been excruciatingly painful. The bones were still healing, incorrectly, as we can see from the deformation, and they made her stand behind them, motionless for the 20 to 30 seconds required for the exposure, with her destroyed hands wrapped in bandages and hidden under white gloves. Angela looked at the photograph on her screen, at Marie's carefully neutral expression. How much strength had it taken to stand there without showing the pain? How much fury had she hidden behind that blank face? What happened to her after the photograph? Angela asked. And do the records continue? Yes, Raymond said. And that's where it gets interesting. Because 3 months after this photograph was taken, Marie disappeared. Raymond returned to Washington with copies of every document he'd found. He spread them across the conference table in Angela's laboratory, arranging them chronologically to tell Marie's story through the fragmentary evidence of paper and ink. July 1861, Raymond said, pointing to a journal entry in Jacques Mercier's hand. Marie has run away. Despite her injuries, she managed to flee during the night of July 19th. Dogs were sent out but lost her trail at the river. The loss is considerable, both financially and in terms of Celeste's inconvenience. Have reported her to local authorities and posted reward notices. He laid out several printed broadsides, runaway slave advertisements offering rewards for Marie's capture. The descriptions were clinical. Marie, approximately 30 years of age, medium height, light brown complexion, speaks French and English. Hands show recent injury. Property of Jacques Mercier. $300 reward for her return. $300 reward, Angela noted. That's a substantial amount in 1861. It tells us how much Mercier wanted her back, Raymond agreed, not just for her value as property, but because her escape was an affront. She'd been punished to break her spirit, and instead, she ran. He pulled out another document. The local sheriff's records show they searched for 3 weeks. They questioned other enslaved people on neighboring plantations. They checked with riverboat captains and traders. But Marie had vanished. How does someone with broken hands, just 3 months healed, manage to escape? Marcus asked. With determination, Angela said quietly, looking at Marie's photograph, and probably with help. Raymond nodded. That's where it gets interesting. In August 1861, Union forces established a base at Ship Island, Mississippi. Enslaved people began fleeing to Union lines, and networks formed to help them escape. Louisiana was still Confederate territory, but there were abolitionists operating underground, and free people of color who helped runaways despite the enormous risk. He pulled out a different type of document, a ledger from a Union Army contraband camp, places where formerly enslaved people who'd reached Union lines were housed and recorded. I found this at the National Archives. Ship Island Contraband Camp, September 1861. Among the refugees recorded, Marie, age approximately 30, from Louisiana Plantation, arrived via swamp routes with injuries to both hands, seeking protection under Union authority. Angela felt tears prick her eyes. She made it. She made it, Raymond confirmed. It took her over a month to travel from Baton Rouge to Ship Island, roughly 200 miles through swamps, bayous, Confederate patrols, and slave catchers, with hands that had been intentionally destroyed. And she made it. Marcus was studying the contraband camp records. Does it say what happened to her after that? Raymond pulled out more documents. The Union kept records of the people in contraband camps. Many were put to work supporting the military, cooking, washing, building. Women with skills were especially valuable. He found the page he wanted. Here, October 1861. Marie, formerly enslaved, employed as seamstress for officers' uniforms, despite injury to hands, demonstrates exceptional skill. Earning wages. She was earning wages, Angela said, her voice thick with emotion. After 30 years as property, she was earning money for her work. There's more, Raymond said, a slight smile crossing his face for the first time. In 1863, after the Emancipation Proclamation, many contraband camps began organizing schools for formerly enslaved people. I found records from a school at Camp Parapet near New Orleans, and look who's listed as a teacher's assistant. He slid the document across the table. Angela read it, her vision blurring with tears. Marie Pierre, formerly enslaved, assistant to primary teacher. Helps students with reading and writing despite injury to hands. Shows remarkable dedication. Marie Pierre, Angela whispered. She took a last name. She claimed a full identity, Raymond said, and she did exactly what they'd tried to prevent. She taught people to read and write. With her broken hands, she taught freed people the skills they'd been denied. Angela looked at the photograph again, at Marie standing behind the Mercier family in her white gloves, hiding the evidence of their cruelty. But Marie had survived. She'd escaped. She'd healed. And she'd used her pain to fuel her purpose. We need to find out what happened to her after the war, Angela said. We need to find her ending. Tracing Marie's post-war life proved more challenging than documenting her enslavement. Raymond explained the frustrating reality. Formerly enslaved people often moved frequently after the war, seeking family, safety, or opportunity. Record-keeping was inconsistent. Many people changed their names or used different names in different places, and for black women especially, the documentation is sparse. But Raymond was persistent, and over the next 2 weeks, he pieced together fragments of Marie's later life through pension records, census data, and Freedmen's Bureau documents. The story that emerged was one of remarkable resilience. After the war ended in 1865, Marie left the contraband camp and traveled to New Orleans. The city was under Union occupation and becoming a center for freed people building new lives. In the 1866 New Orleans City Directory, Raymond found her listed Marie Pierre, seamstress, on 27 Treme Street. Treme was the free people of color neighborhood, Raymond explained. She established herself there as an independent seamstress. With her skills, even with her injured hands, she could earn a living. The 1870 census showed more. Marie Pierre, age 38, seamstress, head of household. And beneath her name, also present, Caroline, age 8, relation, daughter. She had a child, Angela said, surprised. The records hadn't mentioned any children during her enslavement. Born in 1862 while Marie was at the contraband camp, Raymond said, I found a birth record. The father is listed as unknown, which was common for women in camps, but Marie kept her daughter and raised her. He pulled up another document. And look at this. School enrollment records from 1872. Caroline Pierre, age 10, attending school. Mother's occupation, seamstress and teacher. She became a teacher, Marcus said. She never stopped teaching, Angela corrected. She just finally got recognized for it. Raymond had found notices in New Orleans newspapers from the 1870s and 1880s. Small advertisements for Marie Pierre's School for Colored Children, Sewing and Letters. She'd established a small school in Treme, teaching young girls to sew and read, combining practical skills with literacy education. The tuition was minimal, sometimes paid in trade, accessible to poor families. She knew what it meant to be denied education, Raymond said, so she spent the rest of her life making sure others had access to it. But it was a letter Raymond found in a private collection that brought Marie fully to life. It was written in 1885 by Marie to a former student who'd moved to Chicago, and someone had preserved it as part of a family archive. Raymond read it aloud. My dear Sarah, I was pleased to receive your letter and learn of your employment as a typist in that great city. You write that your employer marvels at how well you write despite the appearance of your hands. I smiled to read this, child. I taught you that hands may be scarred, but minds cannot be broken. I taught you this because I learned it myself in the hardest way possible. My hands have been broken since I was your age, but they have sewn 1,000 garments, fed my daughter, written letters, and taught hundreds of children to read. They tried to break more than my fingers. They tried to break my spirit. But a spirit, once it knows itself to be free, cannot be broken. Remember this when the world is hard. Remember that you come from people who survived what should have destroyed them. Your teacher always, Marie. Angela wept openly. Marcus had to look away, his eyes wet. Even Raymond's voice had broken as he read the final lines. She understood what they'd tried to do to her, Angela said, and she refused to let them succeed. With Marie's post-war life documented, the next challenge was to find descendants. Raymond knew this would be difficult. He'd done this work before, trying to connect historical figures to modern families. Record-keeping for black families in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was inconsistent, and many family connections had been lost to time, migration, and the systematic destruction of black genealogical records. But they had advantages. They knew Marie's daughter's name, Caroline. They knew Caroline had been educated, and they knew the family had stayed in New Orleans through at least the 1880s. Raymond started with marriage records. In 1888, he found a record for Caroline Pierre, aged 26, marrying Joseph Thomas, a carpenter from the Treme neighborhood. The 1900 census showed the couple with 3 children, Marie, named for her grandmother, Joseph Jr., and Elizabeth. 3 grandchildren, Angela said, tracing the family tree Raymond was building. Did any of them leave records? The oldest, Marie Thomas, became a teacher, Raymond said. I found her in school board records from the 1920s. She taught at a colored school in the 7th Ward until she retired in 1950. He pulled up a newspaper clipping. And here's something remarkable. When she retired, the Louisiana Weekly did a feature story about her 50 years in education. Listen, Miss Marie Thomas retires after educating 3 generations of New Orleans colored children. Asked about her commitment to education, Miss Thomas credited her grandmother, a formerly enslaved woman who established one of the first schools for colored girls after the war. My grandmother had her hands broken by her enslaver for learning to read, Miss Thomas said. She taught me that education is the one thing they can never take from you. She knew, Marcus said. Marie's granddaughter knew the story, and told it publicly, Raymond added, which means the family preserved this history. He began searching for modern descendants of Marie Thomas, marriage records, birth certificates, obituaries, each one moving the family tree forward through the 20th century. After 3 weeks of searching, Raymond found her, Dr. Desiree Thomas, professor of history at Xavier University of Louisiana, age 43. Her biography on the university website mentioned that she was a 6th-generation New Orleanian whose family had been in Treme since Reconstruction. Raymond called her, carefully explaining who he was and what they'd found. 20 minutes later, his phone rang again. It was Dr. Thomas, and she was crying. My grandmother told me stories, she said, her voice shaking, about our ancestor Marie, who'd been enslaved and escaped during the war, who taught in Tremé and raised her daughter alone. But we never had documentation. We never had proof, and we never knew about the photograph. Raymond arranged for Dr. Thomas to fly to Washington. 2 days later, she stood in Angela's laboratory, staring at the enhanced image of her great-great-great-grandmother standing behind the Mercier family in white gloves, hiding hands that had been broken for the crime of literacy. Desiree was petite, professional in a burgundy suit, but her composure crumbled as she looked at Marie's face. "She looks like my mother," she whispered. "The same eyes, the same way of holding her mouth when she's angry but can't show it." Angela showed her the enhanced images of the gloved hands, explaining what they'd found. Desiree listened, tears streaming down her face. They tried to break her, to make her into what they wanted, but she refused, and then she spent the rest of her life teaching others to refuse. "She did more than survive," Raymond said gently. "She transformed her pain into purpose, and she created a legacy that's been passed down through 6 generations." Desiree nodded. "I teach African American history. I research Reconstruction. I fight for my students to understand that history isn't just something that happened. It's something we carry." She looked at the photograph again. "I've been carrying Marie with me my whole life. Now I finally get to see her face." The museum scheduled a press conference for 2 weeks later, giving time for proper documentation and exhibit preparation. News had leaked about the discovery. A major newspaper had gotten wind of the story and run a preliminary article. By the time the official announcement came, national media was already requesting interviews. Angela stood before a room full of journalists, historians, and museum officials. The restored photograph projected on a screen behind her. Beside her stood Dr. Desiree Thomas and Dr. Raymond Foster. The room buzzed with anticipation. In January of this year, the National Museum of African American History acquired a daguerreotype from an estate sale in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Angela began. "The photograph shows a wealthy plantation family in April 1861 at the outbreak of the Civil War. It appeared to be a standard formal portrait, a family displaying their wealth and refinement. But our restoration work revealed something very different." She clicked to the next slide, showing the enhanced image of Marie's hands. The bloodstains visible through the white gloves, the unnatural positioning of the fingers, the careful way she held her hands to minimize pain. This woman, standing behind the family, is Marie. We now know she was approximately 29 years old when this photograph was taken. 3 months earlier, she had been discovered reading newspapers and documents belonging to the plantation owner. As punishment for the crime of literacy, her hands were systematically broken under medical supervision, with the specific intent of preventing her from ever writing again. The room erupted in shocked murmurs. Angela waited for quiet, then continued. "The white gloves she wears in this photograph were purchased specifically to hide her injuries for this formal portrait. The family wanted to present an image of civilization and refinement. They couldn't allow the evidence of their brutality to show." She clicked to the next slide, showing Jacques Mercier's journal entry describing Marie's punishment. Several journalists gasped. One woman in the front row openly wept. "But this story doesn't end with that photograph," Angela said, her voice strengthening. "Because 3 months later, despite her injuries, despite the intensive search, despite everything, Marie escaped. She made her way to Union lines over 200 miles through Confederate territory. She survived, and then she spent the next 40 years teaching freed people to read and write, using the very hands they'd broken to prevent her from doing exactly that." Desiree stepped forward then, her presence commanding despite her tears. "Marie was my great-great-great-grandmother. For generations, my family preserved her story through oral tradition. But we never had this photograph. We never had this evidence." She gestured to the image behind her. "This photograph was meant to hide the truth. Instead, it preserved it. Marie is looking out at all of us, 163 years later, and she's testifying. She's saying, 'This is what they did to me. This is what I survived. This is who I am.'" Raymond spoke next, explaining the historical context. "What happened to Marie was not unique. Punishment through mutilation was documented throughout the slavery system. Breaking fingers, burning, branding, these were tools of terror meant to control human beings. But what is unique about Marie's story is that we can see all of it. The crime, literacy, the punishment, broken hands hidden under elegant gloves, the resilience, escape and survival, and the legacy, 6 generations descended from a woman who refused to be broken." The questions came rapidly. How had they identified Marie? What other records existed? Would the photograph be displayed? Where was Jacques Mercier's plantation? What happened to his family after the war? Raymond answered the historical questions. Angela explained the restoration process. Desiree talked about her family's preservation of Marie's story and what it meant to finally have documentation. But it was a question from a young black journalist that brought the most powerful response. "Dr. Thomas, what do you want people to understand about your grandmother's story?" Desiree looked at the photograph for a long moment. "I want people to understand that this photograph isn't about the family sitting in their elegant parlor. It's about the woman standing behind them. I want people to see that Marie is looking at us. Not at them, at us. She knew this photograph would outlast all of them, and she's telling us, 'Remember, Remember what was done. Remember who survived. Remember that they tried to break us and we refused to break. The exhibition opened 3 months later, titled Hidden Hands, Marie's Story of Survival and Resistance. The restored photograph occupied the central wall, enlarged to 6 feet tall. Marie's face and gloved hands were clearly visible, along with enhanced detail showing the bloodstains, the finger deformations, the evidence of pain carefully concealed. But the photograph wasn't displayed alone. Beside it were the documents Raymond had found, the plantation records listing Marie's purchase and punishment, Jacques Mercier's journal entries describing her infractions and escape, the contraband camp records showing her arrival at Union lines, the school records documenting her work as a teacher, and the letter she'd written to her former student in 1885. In adjacent cases were artifacts Angela had located, examples of white gloves from the 1860s, medical instruments like those used to break bones, runaway slave advertisements, and teaching materials from Reconstruction-era schools. Each artifact helped tell the story of Marie's world and her resistance to it. The exhibition included a video featuring Desiree Thomas talking about her family's oral history and what the discovery of the photograph meant to her. School groups watched it in reverent silence. Adults wept openly. The comment book filled with responses ranging from rage to grief to determination. But the most powerful element was simple. A mirror placed at the end of the exhibition, beside a quote from Marie's 1885 letter, "A spirit, once it knows itself to be free, cannot be broken." Visitors saw their own reflections next to Marie's words, connecting past to present, her struggle to theirs. On the exhibition's opening day, Desiree stood with her extended family, cousins, aunts, uncles, all descended from Marie. They held hands as they looked at their ancestor's photograph. A local news crew filmed as Desiree spoke to reporters. "My students ask me why history matters, why we have to keep studying the painful parts of our past. I tell them, because if we don't, people like Marie become invisible. The violence done to them becomes erasable. But Marie refused to be invisible. She stared into that camera, knowing we would eventually see her. She survived, knowing we would eventually tell her story. And she built a family that would carry her forward." Angela watched from the side of the gallery, exhausted but deeply satisfied. She'd restored hundreds of photographs in her career, but none had felt as important as this one. Marie had waited 163 years to tell her story. Now millions would hear it. Marcus found Angela near closing time. "You did something extraordinary," he said. Angela shook her head, looking at Marie's photograph one more time. "I just removed the tarnish. Marie did the extraordinary thing. She survived. She transformed her pain into purpose. She refused to let them define her." She paused. "All I did was make sure we could see what she'd been showing us all along." That night, after the museum closed, Angela returned to the conservation laboratory one final time. The original daguerreotype sat in its case, now properly preserved and catalogued. She opened the case carefully and looked at Marie one more time, at that fierce, determined face, at those white gloves hiding broken hands, at the spirit that refused to break. "Thank you," Angela whispered to the photograph. "Thank you for being strong enough to survive. Thank you for staring at that camera. Thank you for making sure we would see." Marie's eyes stared back across more than a century and a half, bearing witness, refusing erasure, claiming her place in history. The photograph that was meant to hide the truth had instead preserved it. And now finally, Marie's story would never be forgotten.